Introduce Dr. Sandra Pavelka, the Law and Policy Panel moderator. So Sandra Pavelka is a professor and founding director of the Institute of Youth and Justice Studies at Florida Gulf Coast University. Even though Dr. Pavelka is an internationally recognized restorative justice expert and scholar, her greatest pride is her 3 kids, Lauren, Brianne, and Connor. Everybody, please give it up for Dr. Sandra Pavelka.
Good morning, everyone. NACRJ, how are you doing this morning? Woo! Wow, this is incredible. We have a wonderful panel ahead. I'm just so thrilled to be here with you today. Restorative justice has experienced unprecedented growth across the United States over the past 25 years. Colorado, Illinois, Minnesota, California, and other states have led the way in establishing restorative justice in law and policy. My research in law and policy shows this evolution and growth. In 2000, 20 states had restorative language and practices in state statutes and codes. Fast forward to 2024, 44 states now have RJ in state statutes and codes. Pretty incredible. So today we have a distinguished panel assembled who will share their experiences advocating for restorative justice law and policy across the U.S. Please help me welcome our panelists. We have State Representative Sandra Feist with the House of Representatives in Minnesota. Dwanna Nicole, Executive Director of Restorative Justice Partnership. Whoa! Beau Rara, Youth Restorative Justice Initiative Lead, Legal Rights Center. And Erica Washington, Senior Restorative Justice Strategist with Equal Justice USA. Great to have cheerleaders out there. So, are all our mics working? Just want to kind of do a mic check here.
Check.
Everybody working out. So to start off the discussion questions, what is your experience with restorative justice legislation? Sandra, would you like to start? The Sandras are on the end, or the bookends.
Yeah, when you've got a panel of 2 Sandras, you know it's going to be awesome. I am an immigration lawyer in my day job, and I ran for office because I wanted to make Minnesota a more just place for all Minnesotans. And my first term was in the middle of the pandemic, and there were not a lot of people in the office. And in the mornings, I would chat with one of my colleagues who had been carrying a bill called the Veterans Restorative Justice Act for many, many years. And he said it had hit like some lawyer issues, and he just didn't know what to do. And he was like, "Do you want it?" And I was like, "Sure, sounds good, restorative justice. I don't quite know what that is, but it sounds important." And I took it on, and it was like a Herculean, complicated lift with lots of drama, but it really educated me and got me really excited about restorative justice and how we could pivot from a punitive, ineffective system of justice to one that is supportive and treats people like human beings. And I got to know a lot of advocates in the restorative justice community. I was also on a bipartisan, bicameral public safety working group where we met every Monday and we would talk about public safety issues that were on people's minds. And we had a number of speakers, including someone from the Legal Rights Center, who talked about children. And it was really clear to me that there was a bipartisan interest in supporting youth in the public safety context. And I was like, oh, I'll take the Veterans Restorative Justice Act and I'll add that to kids, and we'll do the exact same thing. And it'll be really easy. And it turned out that kids are different than veterans. And have different needs and priorities and complexities. And so I started working with experts and started creating a working group and learning more to eventually, a couple of years later, create the Office of Restorative Practices, which is focused on youth. And we got $8 million this biennium and then $5 million per biennium ongoing to fund restorative practices in Minnesota. Thank you. And then this last year, we created a restorative restitution program to ensure that we have funding when kids cause harm, so that the child or their family doesn't have that burden, and we can focus on what they need to be held accountable and to heal, and to make the person who's been harmed heal. So I guess that I'll just leave it at that. But I've been just really inspired. Like, all of you are the experts, but I have been really inspired by what I've learned and seen about the power of restorative practices, and I'm excited to continue to put that into play at the legislative level.
Thank you so much. Erica.
Yeah, wow, good morning, everyone. It's a real honor to be here and to speak in front of so many experts and incredible practitioners in this room. So my experience with restorative justice legislation comes from building programs and building power. I work with Equal Justice USA. I see my folks up here in the front row. Shout out to my team over there. And what we do is we partner with communities across the country to build restorative justice diversion programs. So we will partner both with a community-based organization, a nonprofit, and a criminal legal system partner that will refer cases to that CBO, to that community-based organization for restorative justice diversion. And I think most of us in this room can relate to, the fact that someone can say they do restorative justice, and that can mean a million different things to a million different people. And so it is absolutely critical for us in doing this work that we do it in alignment, rooted in certain core principles. And I bring that up because when I think about my relationship to restorative justice legislation, it comes from my relationship building programs in a principled way, and the reality that there is legislation and policies that really challenge that create barriers to the construction of programs again, these are our principles to how we approach the work, but those principles come into tension with legislation. And so by way of some examples, of course we want to build work that's oriented around the needs of people harmed, right? Centers people harmed in the way that this work is done. Well, that is going to run into legislative barriers that restrict certain offense types from being diverted. Those offense types tend to be offenses where you see many survivors requesting restorative justice, asking for restorative justice, not being interested in the punitive criminal legal system, and we have laws on the books that restrict that. You have laws on the books or policies that restrict how long a process can take. And yes, an end time is important in a lot of cases, a lot of harms and a lot of processes. But again, that might undermine our ability to do this work centering the voices of survivors of harm. A couple others that I just want to lift up. So we build programs that are designed to address the criminalization, to reduce the criminalization of the BIPOC community. We see laws on the book that restrict folks who have criminal histories from being diverted to restorative justice processes. We have a racist criminal legal system. It produces racial disparities, and when you undermine someone's ability to be diverted because of criminal history, obviously that's not going to help you reduce the criminalization of the BIPOC community. Really quickly, we have a principle around this work being diversion front end, so ideally pre-charge. We have laws on the books that restrict when that diversion can actually take place. That's going to create and undermine our ability to build pre-charge diversion programs. It goes on, right? We don't want to net widen. We have laws on the books that restrict which case types can be sent. and you see programs taking very low-level cases. For us, that's not what we want to build, and it's a challenge when you have policies that undermine your ability to build in the principled ways that you are looking to build programs. So again, my experience with legislation really is just my experience trying to build this work, trying to build capacity across the country for folks to access restorative justice. And it is a reality that in this country we have legislation and policy that undermines the ability to build, I think in ways that probably aligns with some of the ways you all want to build this work in your communities. So in the past, I think what we would often do is kind of contort and bend, dip and dive and build out, ways to work around policies and legislation. Sometimes those would look like overly complex referral processes, just things that were not helpful to us. That is not where we are in 2024, and I'm really happy to say that, because we are no longer dipping and diving and contorting. We are building power, and we're changing laws, and we're changing policies. And so, thank you. So for us, really briefly, that's looked like, looking at models. We know that there is the Restorative Justice Coalition of Oregon. They're passing legislation. That is an incredible group of practitioners. They're out there. They have a session today. Check them out. Tristan Edwards, who's been really integral in that process, really respect. They taught us a lot. California, I'm going to talk more about that. We, with some other organizations on the ground, started bringing facilitators into conversation about what are the barriers for your ability to do this work in principled ways, and how do we get rid of those barriers. And so we are power building amongst practitioners. We have focus groups. I'll talk more about that later. I know I've been talking for a while. So anyways, the convo's starting in Virginia. My experience with this is from building programs and building power. Thank you.
Wow. Fantastic. Beau, would you like to chime in?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Happy hump day. I'm really excited even listening to a lot of the things that Erica was sharing are resonant, and I'm really green to this work. I believe we're all born restorative, and also when it comes to legislation and being in a role at the Legal Rights Center, which is a nonprofit law firm that focuses on youth restorative justice. It started in 2021, so I think it was my first year in my role transitioning out of doing direct representation of young people, because I often found that when I was representing young people, I was having to negotiate with families, and it just seemed like a restorative process would be a more meaningful way to resolve conflict. And so within my first year, was connected with the working group that Representative Feist was speaking about, and from that, it was a learning process. I had never been through a legislative session. I had to learn what the pace of the work was. I had given a little bit of advice on expungement or sealing records before, but I hadn't been a part of a process like this. So it was a very new experience, and I tried to bring along as many practitioners as possible into the space, because a lot of times spaces like this, just by nature, are heavy on the system side. So there will be a lot of lawyers in the room, and it's great to have that technical eye for language. And also we have to have practitioners in the room to understand how this actually works, and to that point of what those barriers are. So that was the perspective and the lens. I am grateful for my JD, and often I'm like, I use the JD to get in the room, and then I'm like, how do we bring practitioners and community in the space so that we can talk about what this actually looks like on the ground. And it's a space that I'm really grateful for. The work group has become something that has blossomed into a statewide Minnesota convening biweekly of practitioners online. We're hoping to be gathering in person, and our communities across Minnesota's a huge state. We have such different needs, such different communities, and so it was a deep learning also about how do we get from that place of oh, we're going to mandate this, here's the criteria, to how do we build something where the communities can speak on what that they specifically need, and how do we just get the most resource to them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So what does restorative justice legislation look like in the states? Dwanna, would you like to address that?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm with the Restorative Justice Partnership, and so we primarily work in school communities across the country. We got our start actually in Denver, Colorado, where we saw, yay, Denver, which has been really lifted up as a model. So I'm gonna just kind of talk about like how this work in education spaces has moved from a local level to a state level to a national level. So what we were seeing, but 10 years ago, under the Obama administration, the Departments of Education and Justice issued a guidance around school discipline. So we were seeing a disproportionate number of Black, brown, LGBTQIA+ students being pushed out of school and into what we call the school-to-prison pipeline, so the policies and practices that funnel young people out of school and on the pathway to prison. What they did was they issued a Dear Colleague letter to the states letting them know that they were paying attention to discipline disparities, and if you could not justify those discipline disparities, then there would be actions taken. And so we suddenly saw a lot of school districts across the country revise their codes of conduct. One of the best practices that the federal government suggested was restorative justice. So suddenly we saw restorative justice automatically kind of pop up in codes of conduct around the country. Not necessarily with any supports or resources, we'll talk about that later, but the language was there. And then we saw some state boards follow suit, or in some states, like down the road in Maryland, the work was actually led by the State Board of Education, where they revised their code of conduct first. I remember back then, the Maryland State Board of Education, the National School Boards Association would bring them out as a model for what states could do in terms of their boards of education. It was model legislation that states could pass to be able to shift their codes of conduct and to have the local districts come into compliance as well. And then we saw state level bills in Illinois, in Colorado, in Virginia, right here or down the road in Maryland, passed to also legislate restorative justice at the state level. Again, not necessarily always with funding or resources, but the language was there. And so I would say that's primarily, what we have seen, that we have great language in a lot of places. And so the ability to be able to do the work, funding has not necessarily followed suit. And I will also just say that, when we think about like how we started and how this work got started, we really do have to give credit to those youth and family organizers who, in small pockets throughout the country were really saying that their children were experiencing very harmful policies and practices in schools, that they were naming what was happening to their children, and after decades really of kind of fighting for recognition and attention, the federal government finally paid attention and started doing something about it. So we're in a much better place, but it was thanks to the tireless effort of a lot of organizers on the ground.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Sandra.
Yeah, I thought I could touch on kind of from a legislator's perspective how we can see what other states are doing and gain information and insights and share it. So I had heard about Colorado and the amazing work that Senator Pete Lee, who I got to meet in person today, did, and reached out, and he was a resource, and Deb Witzel, who is also here and I got to meet, yay, were resources as we were just kind of in that really broad brainstorming phase, and then as we were working on our legislation. So it is really great to be able to look to other states and for legislators to connect with one another about strategy, and just kind of what has worked, what hasn't worked, how money is important and helpful. We in Minnesota we've had a law in the books for a really long time that law enforcement can choose restorative diversion, but there's no money with that, although we did create a $500,000 program this year for that, but there hadn't historically been money or any attention paid to that language. Also, there are a couple of organizations that send state legislators all over the country to learn about policy spaces that they focus on, and so because I've been focused on youth justice, one of those organizations has sent me to Washington State, This year, yay, Washington State. Woo. I went to Tacoma, Washington, where they have an amazing youth diversion program and great local programs. I got to visit a shipbuilding program for youth. It was amazing. So we get to see kind of how other states do things, how local programs do things. It was interesting to me in Washington State that there doesn't appear to be a lot of state funding for those types of programs, and so hopefully Washington State can change that. And I'm traveling to San Diego to see a similar program. But yeah, it's just very interesting. There's a lot of energy, a lot of interest in funding these programs. And spoiler alert, we're going to talk about money in a little bit, but money is important. And sustained ongoing funding for local programs is important if we're going to find a way for the state to fund restorative practices that are inherently local and community-based.
Fantastic. And this is a real important one, too, because we don't think of this often. How do you incorporate restorative approaches to legislative advocacy? Sandra, I'll go back to you.
Yeah, so I am the lead. We have this thing called Civility Caucus in Minnesota, and it is 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats in the House and the Senate. And we work together to create spaces for the legislators to just build relationships, see one another as human beings, and then be able to have like collaborations on things we agree on, and also tough conversations about things we don't agree on that come from a place of, some level of trust and mutual respect. So that's something that's always been really important to me, and I think is really important in politics in general. But in terms of very specific restorative approaches to legislative advocacy that I've kind of thought about a lot, one of them is that we should not avoid conflict. I attended a meeting of our Juvenile Justice Advisory Committee recently, and on the back they have all their values, and one of them was like, conflict isn't bad. And I was like, it's true. Like the idea that we can't disagree with one another, or it's somehow bad, like that having different perspectives is inherently negative, I think is so damaging. And we really had to, within the advocacy space, we had to kind of embrace those tensions and work through them, and really hear one another. So I think just acknowledging that when you've got lawyers in the room and professors in the room and community members in the room, like not everyone is coming to the work from an identical space, but everybody is coming to the work with a desire to do something really good. And so embracing those tensions and kind of acknowledging that everybody's there for the right reasons, I think is really important. And I guess I already said embrace different lenses, but yeah, I think that was probably one of the key things, because we had this working group. And it just it grew, and it was just really interesting how just different people were coming into the space with lots of different energy and different ideas, and we really needed to all communicate with one another from a place of respect and trust, and I think we did that.
Thank you so much. Beau, what about from your perspective?
Yeah, I can elaborate more on that working group. So, the things that we do, I think, are often really simple, and it's to fall back on the principles. So the space eventually, we always started with a check-in and a values round, no matter how big it was. And sometimes it wasn't only an hour meeting, but it was really way more important to build those relationships at the beginning and make sure that we heard from everybody. And guidelines did emerge out of the space eventually. And so, I don't know, that to me, using the restorative practices that the practitioners bring to the space was a way to create the space for the disagreement, for the conflict that was necessary to not just write the bill that was the first thought at the beginning of the 18 months that it took to craft this. It took many, many conversations. It took reaching out to other people, being like, whose voice isn't here, that needs to be here, and then holding that making an intentional space for all those voices to be heard. Because after working at my organization, I feel really spoiled because I'm remembering going to meetings where people would just like immediately start talking about an issue or like an agenda item, and we wouldn't like ask each other how we were. And we need to build trust with each other, know about each other's families. We want to know how we're doing, even if it's like you live in Bemidji and I live in Minneapolis. I want to know your name. I want to know about your family, and that makes it easier to have those necessary conflicts. It's hard to have a necessary conflict with a complete stranger.
Amen to that. So we know this isn't easy. It can be easy in some respects, but there are tensions and challenges that come along the way as well. So Erica, could you address some of those that you've experienced?
Sure. Well, if I could just speak really briefly to the incorporation of restorative approaches into legislative advocacy. So I do, when I saw that we were being asked this question, something that I wanted to offer to the group is the importance of, yes, of course, like restorative approaches into legislative advocacy, but I wonder if we need to start even a little bit earlier in just the importance of connecting restorative process to legislative advocacy, which I assume there are groups in here, and I certainly am not throwing stones, that are doing that, but I know a lot of restorative justice programs that are not connecting restorative process to legislative advocacy, or at least don't have the relationships with the people to direct folks to that could then allow them to tap into community organizing and legislative advocacy. So I just want to speak to that really briefly because my early career, my background is as an attorney. I worked for an organization called the Center for Death Penalty Litigation in Durham, North Carolina. I don't know if anyone is in here from Durham, North Carolina. No? Okay, all right. Anyways, yeah, that's where I practice law. It's also where I learned about restorative justice. But why I'm bringing that up is because, as an attorney, I had the tools that allowed me to, as an attorney working in death penalty, I don't think I have to tell a room full of empaths, I was constantly confronted with the most acute grief, deep devastation, sorrow, and the tool that I had was a tool that did much better at weaponizing it than actually providing any level of care. And so when folks at Restorative Justice Durham, I know folks are here from there, so anyways, they're wonderful. And when folks at Restorative Justice Durham kind of brought me in and taught me about restorative justice, what that was for me was, I have this tool that weaponizes grief, and now I am being, I am being invited into this worldview and this set of practices that for me, what I felt that practice does is it has the capacity to metabolize grief, right? And I've seen this written, and I did the research, and I probably shouldn't bring it up because I couldn't find a citation. As soon as I do, I will email to everybody out here, but there is I know I was reading some teachings. It was an indigenous community out in the southwest of this land, and they talked about grief as this potential energy source. And I had never really heard about it spoken in that way. But it was as though, similar to the way that we metabolize food, right? We eat food, we break it down, it becomes energy that our body can use. And what I see, and I not only build programs, I facilitate cases, I see how restorative justice has the capacity to break down deep grief and create energy to be used, right? And so I say that because, right, I think we have a responsibility to that energy. I think we have a responsibility to what it means that folks are activated through this process, and then what next? Because a lot of what we're challenged by are structural harms, is structural oppression. And so, it takes me to these restorative justice questions, which I think everyone has aversion. They tend to, of course, address what happened, who was harmed, and how, what needs did this harm create, who should be meeting those needs that this harm created. But I want us to be asking, right, what are the structural conditions that contributed to this harm happening? What are the structural conditions? Who and what is responsible for maintaining those conditions? And how do we as a community transform those conditions permanently? And I'm not throwing stones. Like, I think that it feels uncomfortable sometimes to ask those questions, and I trust you all as facilitators to know, when and how. But I do want to stress that understanding the context in which agency is able to manifest doesn't mean that there isn't any. We can hold agency and decision making, and we can hold context and structural realities and oppression, and we have to, because RJ metabolizes grief, it creates energy, and where does that energy go? If someone wants to organize, if someone wants to build coalition, who and what are maintaining these conditions, and how do we as a community transform those permanently? And so I had a case, it was an assault case. Both the responsible person and the person harmed, there's this concept of organized abandonment, where you just see policies and legislation, states and capital disinvesting from communities, creating opportunities for unsafe housing and for unreliable employment, right? That was the reality for both of the communities that these folks came from, right? There were real structural conditions that contributed to this harm happening, and I had no idea what to do with that. I really didn't. I hadn't done the research. I didn't have the relationships with coalitions, with organizing. And I will end. I know I'm taking a lot of time. I really wanted to respond to this question. So I guess my point is that I think that it is our responsibility, right? If we are facilitating a process where folks are metabolizing that grief and it creates energy, where does that energy go? And to me, from my look of history, it has always been organizations and institutions that have facilitated people's participation in politics. Right? It's labor unions, it's Black churches. It's not this kind of personal responsibility of your civic duties. It is organizations. I don't care if you're a C3 or a C4, you can participate in issue advocacy, and we have to know where to direct that energy, or we're not doing what Howard Zare told us to do, which is that we have to attend to the causes that are producing harm. And so I just wanted to offer that.
I'm coming right back to you.
I'll be faster.
So the tensions and challenges are there. They're real. So if you could address some of those.
Sure, yeah, and I'll be fast on this. Tensions and challenges, I mean, I guess I'll start. I just kind of gave that whole rah-rah. I do also want to acknowledge, I'm tired. I don't know if anybody else in the room is tired. Okay, I heard a yes up front. Yeah, honestly, it feels like we're just living in whiplash. I think progressive change, especially structural, progressive, long, big change feels hard right now to me in this country. I feel a physical, emotional, I feel a spiritual exhaustion from many of those in the movement that I just want to speak to and acknowledge because it's real. Obviously, we have just death and devastation and genocide in Gaza. We have war in Ukraine. We have Sonia Massey's killing, murder. It's spiritually exhausting. Truly. I also, I don't know where this is, but please find me after. I need to design, but also just be invited into rituals and ceremonies around grieving COVID, grieving the loss. I don't know where we're doing that as a nation. I'm sure we are, and I just don't know where it is. But I haven't been invited into those spaces. And so I think a huge challenge is that we're tired. I think this moment demands hope and space to grieve, and we have to do those simultaneously, and that's difficult. And I think that a lot of our ideas feel very small right now. They feel like we're again attending to the conditions of an unjust society, not transforming an unjust society. And so, I don't know where our Project 2025 is. Maybe my co co-panelists do. But, I want to change the structures of our democracy. I think our bones are broken, and I don't know where the plan is for that, but I'm interested. Yeah, so that feels hard. But as Sujatha Baliga, who was the founder of our project, she always said, live in eternity. Live in eternity. We're trying to build a cathedral here. I don't think I'm going to see it when it's done, but I do want to get a sense of what our plans are, and I just want to put my little nail in the wall. So that's one thing. Really briefly, then gatekeeping. I think gatekeeping by traditional power brokers is really challenging in this work. We heard a little bit about this. Prosecutors associations, police unions, judges, and I work with incredible folks who work in this system. I'm the daughter of a judge. I wasn't going to say that, but it's true. So, I have love there. And, these are folks with dedicated lobbyists, with lobbying expertise, with long-standing relationships with lawmakers, and it's not appropriate to gatekeep this space from the folks who are on the ground facilitating cases and participating in processes. To me, it undermines my faith that you understand what restorative justice is in the first place, because it is absolutely about the solutions to issues being shaped by the people closest to that issue, right?
Amen.
So I'll say that. We need to shift that power. And then, C3s, shout out to Common Justice for their fair access to victim compensation work, right? Again, we've forgotten our responsibility for transforming society instead of just responding to the conditions of it. And so those are the challenges.
Thank you. Sandra, what about you? What have you experienced in your work?
Yeah, while you were speaking, I thought of one more annoying thing that gets in the way of progress. So I'll touch on that first. I was just thinking about how, just in the way that we drafted our language, just the staff, the legislative drafting process, they were just really confused by the ways that we tried to leave space in our definitions. They were like, but this is not how traditional law and order systems work. It's not how we traditionally draft these types of laws. We need to give courts a lot of control. And we were like, no, we do not want to give courts a lot of control. We want to draft, we drafted an equitable grant application. We added some mechanisms into that. And we just, there was a lot of resistance, not just from agency, but just from staff who were like, but that's not how you do it. And that was really an interesting, unexpected challenge. We also had just intra-advocacy challenges that at their heart kind of were the tension between what is our peer vision for what it is we're trying to do and what can we achieve, and how can we best move the needle and make progress. And so to give the kind of biggest example, we were not thrilled about the idea of putting our Office of Restorative Practices within the Department of Public Safety, because we thought that children should be approached from a wellness lens, not how do we stop kids from being bad lens. And so that was something that we really struggled with. From my perspective, I was the vice chair. I'm the vice chair of public safety. That was where I had the most control over money and actually getting it done. And then the agencies where we thought philosophically it might be a good fit, they didn't want it. But it was a really principled kind of point of tension that we struggled with. And we did find a happy medium, which was it'll automatically migrate over to this new Department of Children, Youth, and Families that we created in Minnesota this term. So we found a happy medium, but it was really interesting. One of the community members and experts that we worked with a lot, who was here for one day, but now he's not here. We would argue about this a lot, and we argued about it during a CLE. We did the CLE together, yeah. So there were 100 people there, and we were going at it And afterwards, the organizers were like, "Are you guys okay?" And we're like, "Oh yeah, we argue about this all the time." But it was important, again, to like have those arguments from a place of trust and mutual respect and love. But it was definitely a struggle. I think another struggle is the distrust of government, the distrust of systems that have traditionally or have and continue to fail us. And the idea that we are trying to create an office that will be within state government, but we want them to like honor what it is we're trying to do, which is shift power away from government. So there's kind of a central cognitive dissonance. And then there were also just political tensions. And so trying to frame what we were trying to do in a way that was true to our values and our mission, but also was strategic and could gain as much broad-based support across the aisle as possible, was really important in order to get it done and to get it done with like so much money. And I think one thing that I was really excited about this year with our restorative restitution bill is that this Republican colleague of mine, who I probably don't agree with on anything at all, he told the story during committee when we were presenting our bill about how when he was a law enforcement officer, he found these kids getting into trouble, and instead of like bringing them into the system, he said, "You're gonna help wash this fire truck. And then we're going to have the fire truck in the parade tomorrow, and you're going to have to be in the parade. Like, that'll teach you." And he said it was just wonderful. Like, the kids, like, loved it, and they participated, and he felt so good about it. And so he was, like, really excited about what it was we were doing. And so I think trying to bring in as much support and buy-in and enthusiasm as possible while not, like, trying to say that we're not shying away from what it is that we're trying to do, which is something like revolutionary, is a really interesting challenge.
Great, thank you so much. So this is a question that's asked a lot. Should restorative justice be legislated? And if so, how important is funding in that equation, right? Funding equation, sorry. Dwanna, what do you think about that?
So, yes, and we were talking earlier around like how there is good legislation out there. I think what has sometimes happened is in the implementation of that legislation, we kind of lose the spirit of what we were fighting for. So I'm a big believer in the role that policy can play in kind of changing systems. I also know that it isn't enough. So we have, many places with really great policy, but if we look at what's actually happening on the ground, we would say it's ineffective, and that's because the implementation of it all was poor. Anytime where we are kind of talking about policy change and policy and law, we have to kind of balance this idea of we don't want something that's so broad that people's kind of own biases can kind of come into play. We need something that's, not terribly ambiguous, because research shows the more ambiguous a policy is, the more likely our own biases will come into play when we're enacting that policy. But we also don't want something so prescriptive that we don't give room for people to actually be innovative. And so I agree that policy is necessary, but I also think that it's really, really important that we also continue to focus on the implementation of that policy. And that means, asking for money to hire people, asking for money to train folks. Earlier I talked about, policies even within the state of Maryland where there's, great laws on the books. But when the Code of Conduct was passed 10 years ago, it was passed without any monitoring. It was passed without any funding for educators or school districts to implement the work. It was passed without any money for professional development for educators to learn what restorative justice was or how to actually begin any of the practices. And so we've seen kind of like this haphazard across the state, people trying to do the work with really no direction provided to them, like by the law. And then we've tried like over and over again after that to kind of go back to it and fix it. But by now we're also in a place where people have tried something and they've experienced something that wasn't good for them. And now they have a view of restorative justice based on, poor implementation strategy. And so we are working to both continue to promote restorative justice and dealing with this idea that someone experienced something in the name of the work that wasn't pure, that wasn't done with fidelity. And so people are now leery of it because they didn't experience something as good as it could be. And so when we're thinking about, what our legislation has to include, making sure that, we have like the necessary supports within legislation to actually resource the work. That, as it was said earlier, that it's ongoing funding, not this kind of one-time surge of resources that then goes away in a year, but that we have like a plan on how we're going to continue to fund the work ongoing. And we also know that there's not always like this new influx of money coming. And so for a lot of the organizers who are working on these issues, they're using like a divest invest strategy. And so we're spending a ton of money in a ton of places on things that are actually harming our young people. How do we take that money and provide it to something that we know works and keeps our young people safe and well in schools? And schools aren't seen as these places of oppression, particularly for young people of color. And so making sure that we're like using the money that is there appropriately and spending it on the things that we say that we want.
Thank you so much. And Beau, what are your thoughts?
Well, we're in the implementation phase. So like I said, I'm green to this work and learning in the doing of it. And there's a lot of things that I wish I knew before we embarked on this journey. I've learned that our request for proposal statute in Minnesota is reimbursement based, and we have historical inequities between practitioners of color and white practitioners, and who has the startup funding, to begin a program or to grow a program is a huge thing. And so there's this part of me that, as I see the constellation of how the laws interact, there's pieces that aren't addressed by the statute. And then I also think that I guess maybe this is maybe a concern or a challenge as well, and not as connected to funding. And also, I really believe that we need to look at this as an intergenerational issue, and the question of worthiness. An organizer locally in a separate conversation where we're looking at in Hennepin County and Minneapolis specifically trying to grow our work with adults in restorative justice was saying we're putting our young people in a really vulnerable position because our local media does cover stories, or when it isn't done with fidelity, or when people misunderstand that young people might fall again before they figure it out. I worry about like the backlash and like the narrative around it and how that impacts funding as well. And just limiting this to by age. I just think the question of worthiness is one that I hope that the many people in this room, we can like continue to advocate for all humans to have access to a restorative process, because it's really hard when it's not an intergenerational effort. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And Sandra.
Yeah, so on the should it be legislated and how, we've all kind of talked about, there is that central tension between wanting to promote something in a statewide way that doesn't create restrictions that don't allow communities to figure out what they need and what their priorities and approaches should be. And we started out with a much more mandatey type of idea where it was like very specific, and And really over the course of that multi-year development process, we were able to come to a structure where we have our statewide champion, our new director of the Office of Restorative Practices, who can provide technical assistance and data and resources and guidance to local communities, but isn't going to say you have to do it this way. But at the same time is going to make sure that people aren't calling something restorative that isn't. One of the things that we did in our bill that was creating some guardrails is we included the qualifications for the director in the statute, and the Department of Public Safety asked me not to, and I said, I'm doing it. You don't get to like fully create what you think a good director for this office is. Like, we have very specific expectations about their background and their perspective through which they will approach the role. As far as money, like we've discussed, the ongoing funding is really important, and finding a way to structure that funding that is equitable, which I don't think we've fully achieved in Minnesota, is important. We have our new restorative practices grants, and then one of the other things that I focused on this last term was to more than double this funding for something called the Youth Intervention and Prevention Grants, which was created. It's a statewide program in Minnesota, and it just goes to like restorative practices and just general like intervention and prevention programming for youth, and is super community driven. And I think creating systematic funding that goes to these small programs that serve different communities across the state is a really good model. And when I went to Washington State and Tacoma, they had very similar programs to ones that we have in Minnesota, but they were receiving local funding. There didn't seem to be like a state level systematic effort to fund those types of local programs. So I think there are really great ways to do it. I'm excited by what we're doing in Minnesota, but we were talking last night about how we're going to fix our grant, or like all grants in Minnesota, that process, because the reimbursement model really is problematic.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Could I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
I really also shout out to the Abolition Game of Life yesterday, because yes, it was fabulous. I can't wait for it to drop and for us to play it. And that needs to be the model for how we think about funding, because not only with the RFP issue that I spoke about where it's reimbursement based, we have been pitting practitioners against each other to compete for funding, and it creates ruptures in relationship, ruptures in the movement, and I want us to start from a place of we have everything we need, which some of that reinvestment funding is one model, and I'd love for us to keep dreaming about how we can think from a place of abundance and legislate from a place of abundance instead of scarcity and being like, we need to make these practitioners compete.
So many of you in the room are coalition builders or part of coalitions. So this is another important question for our panel. How important is coalition building, building foundations, building advocacy, and what are some strategies that you've actually had in bridging coalitions? So Erica, if you would start off.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like in a way I've been answering this question in my answer to every other question that I've answered. I feel like we need to build pipelines, we need to build coalitions, and build power. I meant to say this on with respect to my answer to the other question, but a former colleague of mine, Sandra Rodriguez, calls it the restorative pipeline to liberation. And so I challenge everyone, what does that look like for you all, where you all are? The coalition building is absolutely critical. I think coalitions, this is a room of people who recognize the transformative nature of relationships, of being in deep relationship. And so, I think coalitions are a structure that can enhance the better parts of all of our nature to be in relationship with one another in this work. Obviously, there's, the African proverb about if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. It's hard to overstate the importance of coalition building in this work. We are going to really dive into some strategies. I'll speak a little bit now, but check out the California Restorative Justice Policy Coalition's workshop. It's on the last session kind of time slot for today, but we're going to be talking about how we built that coalition and how we were able to do that in a restorative way. So please check it out. But yeah, some of the benefits, I mean, the California Restorative Justice Policy Coalition, we did a series of focus groups across the state of California. So we invited folks practitioners, community-based practitioners, restorative justice facilitators, and folks who had participated in RJ processes. We brought them into focus groups to talk about exactly what I mentioned before, right? What are the barriers to your ability to do this work in principled ways, in the ways that you feel called to do this work? Or, is there a policy that's really supporting your ability to do the work, and it's all because there's one person in power who's making that happen? It's not legislation. It's not going to necessarily remain when that one person leaves office or steps out of that role. And so we sat together, talked for a while about all of that to really understand what are our priorities with respect to California. And it was from those focus groups that led us into the formation of the California Restorative Justice Policy Coalition. In October of last year, we passed AB 60. It created a statutory right for victims and survivors to be informed of the availability of restorative justice opportunities in their communities. So district attorneys, police departments, they have to tell victims and survivors that they have the right to access restorative justice opportunities. So that was a win that came from coalition building. And then, we've been in deep conversation for quite a while on AB 2833, which is about the integrity of restorative justice communications and admissibility. We have parked that, but even the process of understanding, do we push, do we pull back, is this in alignment with our principles? And these are principles that we sat together in coalition and identified, we either support or challenge policy and legislation that aligns with, either it aligns and we support, or it doesn't align and we do not support. And I think in another question, I'll talk about what those actual principles are. But again, the California Restorative Justice Policy Coalition has been a true blessing to get to participate in. And really, I think it goes without saying, what that allows is for us to pool our resources, whether those resources are education, right? I mean, this is a huge learning curve. I think a lot of us, me included, and I went to law school, my basis of knowledge was literally Schoolhouse Rock. That little, how does a bill become a law? That was my basis of understanding. And so we don't know, right? In the same way, you are a layperson, you walk into a courtroom and they're using language you don't know, right? The language is not designed for people to access. And so we had a huge education gap. And so the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and the Research for Change project at UCLA Law, they provided a ton of just education to practitioners to even understand how we go about creating legislative change. We were able to, gather to, the revolution has to be planned somewhere. Does anybody own any property? I don't. But we were able to gather at the beautiful property that's owned by the Ahimsa Collective. We have Danica Rodemal out of the Whole Consulting. Thank God for them. We had organizations within our coalition that had lobbying support that we were able to tap into, right? We would not, 95% of the organizations in this coalition don't have lobbyist support, and so, or consulting support. So capacity, education, spaces to gather, diverse perspectives, capacity when people have to flow in and flow out, all of that are the gifts of coalition. Again, it's hard to overstate the importance of coalition.
Thank you so much. Dwanna, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so before I start, I just want to, there are multiple people, but there are two people in particular who really helped me kind of understand the importance of bringing people together and really being led by impacted folks. And those are the late Ora Shube and Cheryl Graves out of Chicago, Illinois. And if you're a praying person, please keep Cheryl in your thoughts and prayers as she navigates some health challenges. But they were very instrumental in kind of helping me understand that when we're thinking about, like, you know, how do we build coalitions, that we bring everyone to the table, and that we're actually led by the people on the ground. And so what does it mean when we have a young person who is speaking about their very real lived experiences in school, actually telling us what they need, and how do we follow their lead? What does it mean when we have families talking about the harms that their own children have experienced in schools and in some of these systems, and saying, you know, this is what I need, and actually following their lead? That oftentimes it's those folks who are excluded from spaces, excluded from these conversations, excluded from the ability to create policy and change. And if we are lucky to have a seat at the table, how do we make space for them, or sometimes give up our seat so they can participate as well? When we come together, I think, particularly when it's about like a singular issue. Sometimes I meet with folks who I don't necessarily agree with on other things, but this is the thing that we're together for right now. And so when we were doing some of our work in Denver, there was a coalition of like the teachers union at the local and national level, community-based organization that often fought against the district, the school district, and a research partner through a university. And so they came together oftentimes, and they would sometimes have to say, yeah, we're fighting on this issue outside of this room, but when we're in this room, we're going to work together to make sure that restorative justice is implemented in a sustainable way. And so they kind of put aside their differences for that space, and then they were able to work together, oftentimes unlikely allies, to ensure that the work remained a priority within the space. When we talk about legislation, sometimes that breakdown in terms of implementation is also related to the idea that sometimes once the policy is passed, the coalitions actually disband. And so we're all meeting together to get this policy passed, and then once the policy passed, we kind of go our separate ways, but our fight isn't over. Oftentimes the bigger fight is once the policy is passed and to make sure that it's actually having the effects that we wanted it to have. And so you're going to get more pushback. You're going to get more people coming out and saying that this isn't working. You're going to get more people coming out and saying that we don't want this. And now the coalition is gone, and so we're oftentimes scrambling to get people back together, to get people back to the table. And so when we talk about relationships, we have to make sure that those relationships are ongoing. So coalitions have to be ongoing, and they have to be nurtured forever to make sure that when those attacks come, we're still together to be able to fight collectively and not fighting by ourselves, or feel like we're fighting by ourselves, because we've done the work on kind of keeping people together. I also think it's really important to, again, like as people have said, like have those shared set of values, to ask a lot of questions, to ask people kind of what they need, to ask people how this policy can actually change their lives, and to actually, again, like listen and be led by that, to not make people feel small, that we have to, recognize that all the answers that we need are within the room, that we don't have to seek answers other places, and that, again, the wisdom often lies in the people who've been bearing the brunt of these harmful policies and practices in the first place.
For sure. Wow. For sure. Beau, would you like to share some thoughts?
Yeah, what you said really resonated about making sure that a coalition, like once it's assembled, continues to grow and evolve and be engaged. And so it was really important in this last year, after we did pass the bill, we promoted and advertised and had like a huge, I don't know how many people, I feel like there were like 100 people on Zoom across the state of Minnesota, where we were like, here's what it is if you weren't already a part of it. Here's what has passed. Here's what is coming. Here's what we'll need to prepare in order to access the funding, and just doing a lot of community organizing and educating. So we're kind of on the fly, like creating materials, because what I meant about the lesson learned in implementation is that passed last spring. The director was just hired. It's very slow moving, and we don't want to be behind the government in that timeline. When the money comes, we don't want any dollar that was meant for this work to not get to people who are doing this work. And so I'm learning as we're doing it of like how to keep people engaged, because there were some times where this biweekly space, people were like, what are we doing in this? And I'm like, we're kind of waiting to see what the next move is, but here's what the statute says about money. Maybe what you could do is locally start meeting. The statute also calls for a steering committee that's composed of impacted community members that will have a per diem included in it. Start with those people, and they can call the prosecutor and whoever to a meeting rather than the reverse, because that's often how it is. And so we're trying to figure out how to flip the script on how this has usually gone by doing community education about the legislation. I've really gone rogue from like what my role was. My initial role is like to partner with community practitioners and system stakeholders to expand restorative options. This isn't the systems change that I necessarily imagined, and also it is really exciting and historic for Minnesota to be able to be doing this work, and coalition is essential. And yeah, I would just say like community education, making sure that people who maybe haven't yet heard about it get the opportunity to understand what it is and how to access the funding, and providing mentorship. People who maybe historically have been a nonprofit that is a path-through organization for individual contractors, how can you share your wisdom? If you are somebody who has a lot of grant writing experience, how can you share your wisdom with people so that they can grow this work? And the other thing, to speak to the competition comment that I made earlier, is I'm also proud of in the statute that we wrote into it encouraging collaboration, collaborative applications, so that people are continuing to think of each other as partners in this work and not feeling like they're competing for the funding. And keeping that in mind with the coalitions as well, because where people may have differences in approach or different theories about different things, being able to, in your local community, apply together to do this work, or be like, where's the gap? Like doing some mapping of which youth are getting access is the only system involved. And another thing I'm proud of in the statute that we landed on based on moving through many conversations was community-based referrals. We want to be able to provide funding to community to do this work, which we know we already do, without it having to have been a system contact. And so that feels really essential as too, and your coalition is dreaming to where you want to get and making sure you write that into your policies as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sandra, what are some of the lessons learned from your experiences?
Turning the page of my notes. Lessons learned. Principled, bipartisan, restorative justice legislation is possible. So regardless of the politics in your state, it is very possible to reach on both sides of the aisle and get very enthusiastic support. One of the things that we did in Minnesota is we had a virtual field trip to Yellow Medicine County, which is in greater Minnesota, and they have a restorative justice department that is decades old. And I was really heartened by how well attended it was and how it was attended on both sides of the aisle. So it is truly possible to do this work regardless of the political makeup in a legislature. Obviously, if you have a state that has really good progressive taxes, then you have more money to work with, which is helpful. But I think that I was really heartened by how nonpartisan the effort was. And then also, lesson learned is don't let perfection be the enemy of making progress. I feel really good about what we did in Minnesota. Like when you're talking about it, I'm like, yeah, we did that. But as making steps in the right direction that are concrete, that are written into law is just huge. And so, have a vision for total systems change. But there are steps along the way to get there. And so those are my key takeaways.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Dwanna, what about you? What are your thoughts in terms of your lessons learned through all of your work?
Sure. I guess my first lesson is always listen to the children, to the young people. They have so much wisdom and have so much to share. And if we just kind of follow their lead, I always feel that we will be just fine. I think a sobering lesson that I've learned is just this work is so difficult. It is so incredibly difficult and taxing, and it's taxing because we're trying to kind of do work that doesn't fit into the oppressive systems that we're in. That we have to continue to fight, though. We have to continue to try to kind of break down these systems so we can build something new. But that takes its toll on you after a while, and so you have to have like a great group of people that you can go back to where you can feel whole. I'm very fortunate to have an amazing group of people who surround me with love, and when there are hard days, we kind of pull each other up. We don't have to have all the answers. The answers are there, but one person does not have to be responsible for the totality of the work. That all the answers are within us. And so if we just, again, like build a great group of people, build a great team, you'll have every single thing that you need. I also just, how important it is to, again, like kind of center community and be in community. I think especially when we're talking about our education spaces, how do we acknowledge that the schoolhouse is not always seen as a safe place for many of our folks, both our young people and our families. And so as much as we can, when we're thinking about organizing or doing this work, how do we actually take the schoolhouse out of the equation and meet where the people are? And so I think, going to where people are and doing the work in partnership with them, that we can't say that we want to, build a coalition or be in community with folks and then always expect people to come to us, that we have to go to where the people are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Erica.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think I've learned the lessons that were named, really critical lessons. The two that I would add, one is that I think I see a lot of community folks getting invited to provide testimony, but not to be the ones whose imaginations are actually shaping the legislation that's being put forward. Tokens get spent. And so I just want to say, as someone who's seen that time and time again, what I'm talking about is how it is our imaginations that are shaping what is actually being produced, the bill that is being put forward, not traditional power brokers shaping the bill and then asking us to testify on its behalf. So wanting to put that out there. The other thing I just wanted to kind of return to is just, sitting in coalition space and doing the work to identify, we practice restorative justice in so many ways, right? And so how is it that a group of people across an entire state can come together and feel like they've identified enough alignment to then work together, right? To push things together, to stop pushing things together, to challenge things together. And so for us in California, we have a coalition that has developed a shared baseline of principles and understandings from which policy changes are either advocated for or against, considered, and proposed as the group decides. And so this coalition supports policy changes that maintain and expand access to community-based restorative and transformative justice, that shifts power to communities and away from punitive, destructive systems held by the state, that redirects funding currently supporting punitive responses to harm to supporting community-based and healing-centered responses to harm in a manner that is abundant, equitable, and sustainable. We promote policy that promotes truth-telling and genuine accountability, both systemic and interpersonal. We support relational healing practices rooted in the wisdom and needs of BIPOC communities, and we ensure that the integrity of restorative justice is protected. And we came together, we worked together, we worked hard to identify those principles, and it is how we move.
Fantastic. So in our remaining few minutes, what are some pieces of encouragement that you can share with our group today? Sandra.
Yeah, well, just success is possible in collaboration with one another. I have been so inspired and educated by the work that I've done with Beau and with the working group. Just one other random example that really inspires me is this year we had a little bit more money. It was policy year, but we had a little bit more money. We wanted to do more around youth justice. And I and a couple colleagues just gathered together a bunch of people, a bunch of impacted youth and community members, like law enforcement, like experts, and we just gathered together in a convenient space for the community, and we're just like, we broke into like little groups. Oh no, this is too long of an answer. This is supposed to be speed round. Sorry, but anyway, we all gathered together, and like the main takeaway, they were like, we want more opportunities for like jobs for kids who are coming into contact with law enforcement regularly. Like what they really need is like jobs and opportunities and hope. And so we wrote a bill to do that. We got $500,000, which is not like that much money, but we got some. And it's going to go to that. And it was the result of this just really inspiring, informative conversation. And so progress is really, truly possible.
Fantastic. Beau.
Hard to be succinct. I guess I kind of want to echo what was already said by Dwanna of making sure that you have like your grounded people, your supports, and as long as you have that people who are going to pour into you, you can stay in any challenging conversation. And all of the skills that you have within you right now, all of the magical questions that you're so good at turning and having emerge are the same ones that can pivot a conversation to open a heart to bring somebody along that maybe you thought would never align on this, because I do believe that we all want to return to a restorative way.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, Dwanna.
I'd say don't stop dreaming, that change is possible. It has happened before. It will continue to happen. Everyone has unique gifts, and so just how do we kind of surface those gifts and work together? And then organizing is happening all over the place. It doesn't necessarily look like it's always under the umbrella of an organization, but parents talking to one another when their children get out of school about what's happening in the schoolhouse is organizing. Children meeting together after school to talk about what's happening to them is organizing. And so just find the folks who are doing the work. There are people doing the work in your communities, regardless of whether or not they're kind of officially listed somewhere. There are people who care about these issues that are out there. Find them, build with them, pay them, and then we can get there. We can get to where we want to go.
Thank you. And Erica.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add, I think we're either actively or passively creating the world around us. And so I just invite you into activation, and you got this, all the encouragement in the world. I think we can change the world, and so let's do it together. Thanks.
Thank you so much for being here, and thanks to our panelists. Thank you for the great work you do on a day-to-day basis.